87 people left for California in the summer of 1846. 40 of them died. And the part most people fixate on, the cannibalism, is probably the 6th or 7th worst thing about this story. The Donner Party gets filed under a simple label. Stupid pioneers took a shortcut, got snowed in, ate each other. That version is comfortable, because it lets you keep your distance. They made one bad call, paid the price, end of story. Except it was not one bad call. It was months of compounding failures, moral collapse, racial violence, and a slow-motion starvation that ground through boiled leather and family pets long before anyone touched a human body. The core party consisted of 87 people travelling in 23 wagons, 29 men, 15 women, and 43 children. Nearly half the party were children. Not teenagers playing at being adults on the frontier, but small children, toddlers, and infants. The survivors who carried this trauma for the rest of their lives were mostly kids under 15. That changes the texture of everything. The National Park Service counts 40 dead and 47 survivors from the core group. Britannica, counting 2 men who joined late near Truckee Lake, puts the total at 89 with 42 dead. Either way, the death rate was close to half. So let me walk you through what actually happened, because the beginning matters more than people realise. The Donner and Reed families were not desperate. They were prosperous Illinois farmers and business people, comfortably middle class by the standards of 1846. George Donner was in his 60s. James Reed was ambitious, well-connected, and had built a massive 2-story wagon nicknamed the Pioneer Palace Car, complete with a built-in iron stove and spring-cushioned seats. These were people who expected to arrive in California in style. They had money, they had supplies, they had no particular reason to take risks, which makes what happened next harder to explain. They left Springfield, Illinois on April 14, 1846, reached Independence, Missouri around May 10th to 12th, and joined a larger California-bound caravan. The conventional wisdom of the time was blunt. Leave by early May, and do not be at the Sierra Nevada crest after October. Their departure was already on the late side for a journey of about 2,200 miles that would take 4 to 6 months. Nobody panicked about this. The weather had been mild, the grass was good, and optimism was cheap on the trail in the spring. It is easy to be brave in May when the mountains are still just a rumour on the horizon. Now here is where the story starts bending toward catastrophe, and it bends because of a book. Lansford Hastings was a lawyer and land promoter who had published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California in 1845. In it, he described a new route, the Hastings Cutoff, that supposedly saved 300 to 500 miles and up to a month of travel. It sounded perfect. It was a sales pitch dressed up as geography. Modern analysis and diaries from the period show the cutoff was about 125 miles longer than the established trail and crossed far worse terrain, including the Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had never taken wagons through most of the route when he wrote the book. He was selling land in California and needed bodies to fill it, and if those bodies had to suffer getting there, that was someone else's problem. At Fort Laramie, something happened that deserves to sit with you for a moment. James Reed ran into an old friend, a mountain man named James Clyman. Clyman had actually travelled through the territory Hastings was promoting. He told Reed, directly and clearly, not to take the cutoff. He called it dangerous and told Reed to stay on the established trail. Reed thanked him and ignored every word of it, and the rest of the party followed Reed. They chose the book over the man who had walked the ground. That single decision, made in comfortable weather with plenty of daylight and full stomachs, killed 40 people. At Fort Bridger, at the end of July 1846, they turned off onto the Hastings Cutoff. 23 wagons, 87 people, including 43 children. What followed was about 2 weeks of hacking a wagon road through the Wasatch Mountains. They dragged wagons up and down canyons that no wagon had ever crossed, cutting trees, clearing boulders, winching heavy loads over ridgelines with ropes and raw muscle. The terrain was not just difficult, it was the kind of terrain where a single overturned wagon could block an entire company for a day. Every day in the Wasatch was a day they did not have. It devoured their time, their grass, their animals' strength, and whatever unity the group had left. By the time they emerged from the mountains and faced the Great Salt Lake Desert, they were already behind schedule and already tired and already starting to turn on each other. Hastings had left a note promising a 2-day crossing of the desert. It took 5. The salt flats were blinding white. The air tasted alkaline, and the heat was relentless. Dozens of cattle died or wandered off chasing mirages of water that did not exist. Families abandoned wagons in the salt. People threw away furniture, tools, clothing, anything to lighten the load enough to keep moving. James Reed lost most of his wagons and nearly all his oxen. The Pioneer Palace car, the 2-story rolling mansion with its iron stove and spring seats, sat somewhere in the salt, stripped and useless. 5 days for what was supposed to take 2, 5 days with not enough water. When the Donna Reed party finally rejoined the main California Trail on the Humboldt River in late September, every other 1846 emigrant heading for California was already past the Sierra Nevada. Every single one. The Donner Party was the last group on the trail, and they had done it to themselves by following an untested route promoted by a man who had never driven a wagon through it, after being personally warned against it by someone who had. If you include the time spent in the Wasatch and the extra distance of the cutoff itself, the shortcut that was supposed to save them a month had cost them about a month instead. The math is brutal in its simplicity. I keep coming back to that because it matters for the moral weight of everything that comes after. This was not bad luck. This was manufactured lateness. The Humboldt River stretch should have been the easy part. It was not. On October 5th, 1846, teamster John Snyder was whipping his oxen up a steep hill. James Reed stepped in, words were exchanged, and it escalated fast. Snyder struck Reed in the head with the butt of his whip. Reed drew a knife and stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder was dead within minutes. The wagon company held a kind of frontier trial on the spot. Some wanted Reed hanged on the spot. Others argued self-defense, pointing out that Snyder had struck first. The compromise was banishment. Reed was forced to ride ahead alone to California while his wife and 4 children stayed with the party. His family was still months from safety, and the group voted to strip them of their most capable leader during the stretch that would matter most. Reed eventually reached Sutter's Fort and became one of the key organisers of the rescue parties. That decision to banish him may have saved lives later. It certainly cost lives in the short term. While resources tightened on the Humboldt, the moral fabric kept tearing. German immigrant Louis Keseberg forced an elderly Belgian passenger named Hardcoop out of his wagon, claiming his oxen were too weak to carry the extra weight. Hardcoop fell behind, collapsed somewhere on the trail and was never seen again. A few men went back looking for him. They did not try very hard and they did not look for very long. This was before the snow, before anyone was trapped. A man was left to die on the open trail because he was old and inconvenient, and nobody was willing to sacrifice an ox to keep him alive. Throughout Nevada, Shoshone and Paiute groups raided the wagon train, mostly targeting livestock. The emigrants called these attacks depredations. The context complicates that word considerably. Emigrant herds were devouring the scarce grass along the Humboldt River, the same grass that fed the wildlife that native communities depended on. The livestock raids were resource defense as much as aggression. Still, each stolen or killed ox was one less animal to pull wagons and one less animal to slaughter for food later. The party was bleeding resources from every direction. By late October 1846, snow was already dusting the high country of the Sierra Nevada. Most of the party reached Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake. A storm on October 30th and 31st dumped heavy, wet snow that blocked the pass. They tried to push through and could not get over the pass. They tried again, and the drifts were too deep. The animals floundered, and people sank to their waists with every step. They turned back to the lake. Most families built or crowded into crude cabins at the lakeshore. About 3/4 of the emigrants ended up there. The Donner families, George and Jacob and their wives and children, lagged 6 to 8 miles behind the main group because of a broken axle and injuries sustained in the Wasatch weeks earlier. They set up a makeshift camp at Alder Creek with wagon canvas, brush, and a lean-to shelter. It was far more exposed than the lake cabins and far less adequate for what was coming, and what was coming was not one storm. It was storm after storm after storm, from November through January and into February and March. Patrick Breen, an Irish Catholic farmer, kept a diary at the lake camp from November 20th, 1846 to March 1st, 1847. It is the only day-by-day written account from inside the camps. His entries are terse to the point of pain, weather, death's hunger. He records storms lasting days at a time, temperatures cold enough to freeze everything around camp, and food shrinking to nothing. He rarely mentions cannibalism directly, though later testimony from survivors makes clear it was happening around him. Historians have read his silence as deliberate omission, or as the inability to put the horror into words while it was still happening. Probably both. The diary is chilling not for what it says, but for how little it says, and what you have to fill in yourself. Historic photos of tree stumps cut by members of the party show stumps many feet above current ground level. Archaeologists have used these stumps to estimate snow depth of 10 to 20 feet around the lake. That is not a snowstorm, that is burial. Mobility was nearly impossible without snowshoes, and they had almost none. Early attempts to cross the pass in November failed when people sank into drifts up to their chests and staggered back exhausted. They were sealed in. Now comes the part most people skip to, and I want to slow it down because the speed of the popular version is dishonest. The jump from trapped to cannibalism implies there was nothing in between. There was plenty in between, and it lasted weeks and months. Normal rations went first. Flour, bacon, some beef. That ran out quickly with 80-odd people eating from a shared supply. Then they slaughtered whatever cattle and oxen they had left, and later dug frozen carcasses out of the snow when they could find them under 10 feet of white. Then the dogs. The Reed family's dog Cash was killed and eaten. Then rats and whatever small game they could catch. Archaeology at the camps found bones from rodents, rabbits and other small animals, all processed down to tiny fragments. Then the hides. They boiled rawhide from wagon covers, ox yokes and shoes into a glue-like substance that barely counted as food. Breen's diary mentioned subsisting on oxhide for days at a time. Later accounts describe people chewing on scraps of hide for hours, just to soften them enough to swallow. In the Murphy cabin at the lake, someone cut up and toasted pieces of the hearth rug. At Alder Creek, archaeologists found burned nails and hardware from wagons and furniture, evidence that the Donner families burned nearly everything combustible just to stay warm. Excavations found animal bones chopped into small fragments with what archaeologists call pot polish, a smoothing that comes from being boiled for a long time, plus grease extraction marks showing they boiled the same bones over and over to pull out the last traces of fat. This is what starvation looks like when it goes on for months. It is not one awful moment, it is a long grinding descent through everything you own, everything you recognise as food, and then everything you do not. Even at sites where cannibalism remains archaeologically uncertain, specifically at Alder Creek, the material evidence tells a story of absolute methodical desperation. People who had left Illinois with spring-cushioned wagons and iron stoves were eating rodents and boiling the same bones for the third or fourth time to extract a film of grease. All of this was happening in two separate camps with limited contact between them. The lake camp had cabins, which meant walls and roofs, however crude. Alder Creek had canvas and brush. The Donner families at Alder Creek were more exposed, worse sheltered, and more isolated. George Donner had injured his hand badly weeks earlier, and the wound festered and refused to heal. He was slowly dying of infection while his family starved around him. His wife Tamsin, educated and competent, managed the camp as best she could while watching her husband decline and her food supply disappear. On December 16th, 1846, 17 people left the lake camp on crude snowshoes to try to walk to California and bring back help. The group was later called the Forlorn Hope, a military term for a near-suicidal vanguard mission. 15 ended up making the journey. The group included 5 women, several young men, and 2 Miwok men named Luis and Salvador. Luis and Salvador need a proper introduction because their part of this story is where the whole thing turns from tragic to something much worse. When Charles Stanton had travelled ahead to Sutter's Fort earlier that fall to bring back food for the stranded party, John Sutter provided not just supplies, but also 2 Miwok men to help guide and support the emigrants on the trail. Historian Joseph King, working from Mission San Jose records, identified these men as likely Ima and Kweyuen. Salvador, or Kweyuen, was about 28 years old. Luis, or Ima, was about 19. Both were missionized Miwok men who had been absorbed into Sutter's labour system, which was coercive at best. Many historians describe it as a form of forced labour or effective enslavement. These 2 men had already helped keep the Donner Party alive once by carrying critical supplies through difficult mountain terrain. The Forlorn Hope set out with 6 days of rations for a journey that would take far longer than 6 days. They had no map of the route ahead. Their snowshoes were frames of bent wood laced with rawhide strips, and several pairs broke within the first days. By Christmas they were starving, and people were dying in the snow. They had wandered off the course and had no idea how far they still had to go. The survivors debated killing one of their number for food. Someone suggested drawing lots. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor farmer, drew the short straw. Nobody could bring themselves to do it. There is something in that moment that is worth pausing on. They were desperate enough to agree that someone should die so the rest could live, organised enough to draw lots, and then could not follow through when the lot fell on a man they knew. Shortly after, Dolan became delirious, stripped off his clothes, ran out into the snow, was dragged back by other members of the group, and died on December 26th at what the survivors later called the Camp of Death. They ate Dolan, and the bodies of Franklin Graves and others who died. They dried strips of flesh and carried them as provisions for the march ahead. One detail that often gets lost: of the 17 people who set out, the 5 women all survived. The men died at much higher rates. Whether that was physiology, fat reserves, or the fact that the women were given slightly preferential treatment by the group is something historians have debated without settling. Luis and Salvador refused to eat human flesh. What happened next is the part of this story I find hardest to move past, and it is the part most casual retellings skip entirely or mention in a single sentence. As food ran out again and the Forlorn Hope group continued to weaken, some members began openly discussing killing Luis and Salvador for food. The 2 Miwok men were viewed as expendable. Someone in the group warned them about what was being planned. Luis and Salvador fled into the snow terrified. Days later, the remaining Forlorn Hope survivors found Luis and Salvador lying in the snow, too weak to move. William Foster shot both men. The group butchered their bodies and used them as food to keep walking. These were the only people in the entire Donner Party ordeal who were deliberately killed so that others could eat them. Not Patrick Dolan, who died on his own before anyone acted on the lots. Not the people who starved in the lake cabins. 2 Miwok men who had been coerced from Sutter's labour force, who had carried supplies through the mountains to save these emigrants, who had refused to eat human flesh themselves when offered. They were murdered by the people they had come to help, and the reason they were chosen was not random. It was racial. They were the outsiders, the ones whose lives were counted as worth less. The remnants of the Forlorn Hope, sustained in part by those murders, staggered on until they stumbled into a Miwok village. The villagers saw their skeletal condition, their frostbitten skin, and fed them acorn bread and cakes cooked on hot stones. They helped the survivors move onward toward the American settlements, passing them from community to community. These Miwok people did not know that 2 of their own had just been killed and eaten by the strangers they were now feeding. Hold that. Sit with it. Because the popular version of this story treats the cannibalism as a morally neutral survival choice, grim but understandable, something anyone might do. Maybe that framing is fair for eating the already dead. The killing of Luis and Salvador was not morally neutral, it was murder, and the victims were chosen because of who they were. Back at the camps, the dying continued through January, February and into March. Breen's diary records death after death in flat, clipped language. The rescue effort began in earnest after Forlorn Hope survivors reached Johnson's Ranch and Sutter's Fort in mid-January 1847, with news of how many people were still trapped. James Reed, banished months earlier for the killing of Snyder, threw himself into organising relief. 4 main rescue parties fought their way back through deep snow over the following weeks and months. The first relief left Sutter's Fort on January 31st and reached the lake camp on February 18th, 1847. What they found was barely recognisable as a camp. Emaciated people emerged from cabins half buried in snow, too weak to walk in some cases. They brought out 23 people, 17 of them children. Several of those rescued died on the march out through the snow, too far gone to recover even with food and warmth. The second and third relief parties arrived in late February and March, each time removing more survivors and each time arriving to find fresh evidence of cannibalism. Rescuers described bodies with flesh stripped from the limbs, piles of bones, a torso with the heart and liver removed, human remains mixed in with discarded animal bones around the campsites. Families who had refused to eat human flesh were visibly weaker and closer to death than those who had, which confirmed a brutal calculus that nobody wanted to think about too carefully. Eating the dead kept you alive, and refusing to do so brought you closer to becoming one of them. The fourth relief, led in part by William Eddy and William Foster, the same Foster who had shot Lewis and Salvador, reached the camps in April and retrieved the last survivors. Very few people were still alive. One of them was Lewis Keseberg. Keseberg is the character in this story who absorbed everyone else's guilt, and that process started almost the moment he was carried out. When the last rescue party arrived, the most sensational claim was that they found Keseberg alone in a cabin, surrounded by corpses, with a pot of human organs cooking over the fire. He admitted eating human flesh. He denied killing anyone for food. Rescuers accused him of murdering Tamsen Donner, George Donner's wife, and taking her money. Tamsen Donner was educated, widely admired, and fiercely loyal. She was a former schoolteacher, literate and articulate, in ways that many people on the trail were not. When relief parties offered to take her out of the Sierra, she repeatedly refused to leave her badly injured husband George at the Alder Creek camp. George's hand wound had turned gangrenous, and he could not walk. Tamsen made a decision that everyone around her understood, and nobody tried to talk her out of more than once or twice. She sent her daughters to safety with the rescuers, but she stayed behind with the man she'd married. It is the kind of choice that gets called heroic in one sentence and foolish in the next, and neither word quite fits. Her exact fate has never been resolved. Some sources say she died at Alder Creek with George. Others suggest she later walked to the lake cabins and died there. Keseberg's enemies accused him of killing her for money she was supposedly carrying. Serious historians treat the murder allegation as unproven. There is no definitive evidence either way, and there likely never will be. Keseberg was charged with 6 murders after the ordeal ended. He was acquitted for lack of evidence on all counts. He then did something that surprises most people who hear about it. He sued rescuer Edward Coffeemeyer for defamation over claims that he had stolen money and property from dead emigrants. Keseberg won the case. The court awarded him $1 in damages and made him pay the legal costs. That is the judicial system telling you, in the driest possible language, that yes, technically you were defamed, but there is nothing left of your name to compensate. Journalists had already branded him the human cannibal. Stories circulated that he had hung a boy's body like game meat, that he preferred human flesh to beef, that he had killed Tamsen Donner and boiled her body down for the fat. The stories grew with every retelling, which is what happens when a real horror meets a public appetite for monsters. Modern historians tend toward a more complicated view. Keseberg was almost certainly a difficult man. His earlier behaviour, forcing the elderly hardcoop off his wagon to die, suggests someone capable of cold selfishness when resources were tight. He was also a convenient target. A horrified public needed a single face to carry the weight of what had happened, and Keseberg, German-born and already unpopular within the party, fit the role. It was easier to say one man was a cannibal monster than to say that ordinary families ate their dead neighbours so their children could eat one more day. Keseberg carried that for the rest of his life. He died in Sacramento in 1895, nearly 50 years after the ordeal, and the first line in his obituary was about cannibalism. One more piece of this that most popular versions leave out completely. The Donner Party was not alone in the Sierra Nevada. The Washoe people had lived in the Truckee Lake region for thousands of years. They had winter survival knowledge that the emigrants could not have imagined. Pine nut caches gathered and stored in autumn, rabbit fur cloaks stitched together for warmth, ice fishing techniques for frozen lakes, and willow hut shelters specifically designed to handle heavy Sierra snow. They knew how to eat in this landscape when it was buried under 20 feet of white. The emigrants did not, and the gap between those two realities is the quiet centre of this story. Washoe oral histories, documented by archaeologists and historians working on the Donner Party sites, indicate that Washoe scouts observed the trapped emigrants from the surrounding forest throughout the winter. They watched. They debated what to do about these strangers who were clearly dying. On at least one occasion, Washoe individuals approached the camps and offered food, roots and pine nuts. In a separate encounter, emigrant William Eddy shot and killed a native man who had earlier shot arrows into their oxen, deepening fear and hostility among every group involved. Some Washoe oral accounts describe approaching the starving emigrants with food later in the winter and being shot at. which kept them away after that. People were dying of starvation while others who knew how to feed them in that landscape were being driven back with gunfire. This is where the story stops being about weather and bad decisions and becomes about who these people were and what they believed. They were heading into Mexican territory during the Mexican-American War, driven by dreams of land and opportunity under the ideology of manifest destiny, which treated American expansion as natural and God-given and normalized the dispossession of anyone already living on the land they wanted. That ideology produced the gold rushes, the railroad, California statehood. It also produced 87 people trapped in the snow, eating their shoes and their dogs and eventually each other, while the indigenous people who could have kept them alive were shot at for getting too close. Archaeologists working at Alder Creek, led by Donald Hardesty in the 1980s, and later by Kelly Dixon and Julie Shablitsky in the 2000s, confirmed the Donner Camp locations through wagon parts, nails, domestic artifacts, writing slates and ceramics. Their bone analysis found cattle, horse, dog, deer, rabbit and rodent remains, all chopped and boiled with clear signs of heavy grease extraction. No definitive human bone was identified at Alder Creek. DNA from fragments was too degraded to tell. The team has been careful to say that this does not prove cannibalism did not happen there. Unburned human bone could have decomposed in the acidic soil, or remains might have been consumed so completely that nothing identifiable survived. Written evidence from rescuers and survivors strongly supports that cannibalism occurred at both camps. The physical evidence is limited and mixed. Dixon and Shablitsky have publicly said the Donner family probably least deserved the label that became permanently welded to their name. Virginia Reed was 13 during the ordeal. Her father James had been banished for killing Snyder, her family had nearly starved, and she had watched people around her die and be consumed. After resettling in California in the spring of 1847, she wrote a letter to her cousin Mary Keyes back in Illinois. 2 sentences from that letter have travelled through a century and a half of American memory. She thanked God that her family had survived and that they were the only family that did not eat human flesh. That claim may or may not be true. The Reeds clearly wanted it on the record, and Virginia put it there at age 13 with the confidence of someone who had already seen enough to know how the world would judge them. She closed with advice that has outlived every other detail of the story. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. Eliza Donner was 3 years old when her family was trapped at Alder Creek. She grew up carrying a surname that had become a national synonym for the worst thing Americans could imagine pioneers doing. In 1911, at the age of 68, she published a memoir called The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate. It is full of her memories of the storm, her father's slow decline, and the shame and rumours that followed her for her entire adult life. She was 3 when it happened. She spent 65 years answering for it. The survivors spent decades managing what the public believed about them. Some emphasised their piety. Some stressed they ate only the already dead. Some insisted their particular family had never participated. The name Donner itself calcified into shorthand for cannibalism, which stripped away everything else. The weeks of boiled hides and gnawed bones, the children who made up nearly half the group, the 2 murdered Miwok guides, the Washoe shot at for offering food, the broken axles and abandoned wagons, and a lawyer's book full of comfortable lies. The last survivor left the Sierra on April 21, 1847. They had been trapped for roughly 4 months. 23 wagons went in. 40 people did not come out. Never take no cutoffs.